Okay, good morning, everyone. Welcome back to the Bretton Woods Committee's 2022 International Council Conference. We've had a really fantastic week so far, and it was so good to see so many people yesterday in person at the IMF. I don't think that we could have asked for a better agenda or a better session. So really good to see everybody back in person, and really excited to continue our International Council today with online with another fantastic group of speakers here. We're going to talk about sort of one of the newer topics that BWC has been working on recently in terms of digital assets and effective regulation. The speakers today have all been integral to our work in this space, and I just really want to thank them for the time and intellectual leadership that they've contributed to this project. They're going to be discussing their two new publications that are released today. They're available on our website, so you can find them there. I will let them share more about their work and the project. But before I turn it over to them, I just want to remind our audience that, as always, we will save time for some audience questions towards the end of the session. So if you have a question, please submit it through the Q&A function in Zoom, and then we'll collect these, and then we'll call on you when it's time for Q&A. So now just a quick introduction of who we have with us today. We have Richard Berner, who is a clinical professor of finance and co-director of the Volatility and Risk Institute at NYU's Stern School of Business. We have Bill Dudley, who is, of course, BWC chair. He is also the co-lead of our digital finance project team. Of course, was also former president of the New York Fed. We have with us Greg Johnson, who is the founder and CEO of Rubicon Crypto. And moderating today's conversation is Carolyn Wilkins, who's an external policy member of the Bank of England's Financial Policy Committee and a senior research scholar at Princeton University, where I think she has an office down the hall from Bill, who she co-leads this project team with. So once again, thank you everyone for joining us today. Thank you for your work on these two publications. And Carolyn, I'll turn it over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Emily. I'm just thrilled to be moderating this session that is really reflecting a couple of papers that just came out. They're hot off the press. But first, a little background on this group. So the working group, the Digital Finance Working Group, was established in December 2021. And what we wanted to do was really bring together leaders that were in the private and public sectors. And we wanted to do that to not only just discuss emerging trends in the digital finance area, but think about what really were the valid opportunities, the challenges that it could present to global finance. And through our working papers or our discussion papers, really prompt a discussion about how we could get the most out of these developments. And so it's not surprising that where we started with a brief in June, that was an overview of the issues that Bill and I did. We had a really great paper about the opportunities that could be like concrete opportunities that could be achieved with respect to the use of digital finance. Stable coins is one of the examples. And of course, today we continue that with the technology. What does the underlying technology present, and in terms of opportunities and challenges? Now, of course, it's important to start there, because if there aren't any opportunities, then your frame of mind for regulation isn't really in the right spot. And so now that we've done that, set the stage, the fourth brief that was published today is about some of the regulatory issues related to investor protection, market integrity, and financial stability. So with that, maybe what I can do, we have more briefs coming. Maybe Bill will talk about that at the end, little preview of what else we're going to do. But maybe what I could do with our panelists is just start off with a really general question. It's not a given in a lot of people's minds, certainly not in my mind, that regulation is always needed, and certainly not at the beginning of a particular innovation, whether it's in finance or in other areas, and that there have to be some pretty good reasons to regulate and objectives. And so my question to you is, well, why should we regulate crypto and DeFi activities? And what would be, if we were to do this, the key goals and the principles that would govern this kind of regulation. So maybe with that, I'll start with, why don't you kick it off, Bill?
So I think we need to regulate these activities because they've grown to a size now that when there's, rapid reversals in the market, people get hurt. And I think people don't fully understand the risk associated with some of these activities. The Luna Terra stablecoin collapse is a great example of that, where tens of billions of dollars were wiped out in a week. So it's getting big enough that you care about the consequences for people who aren't sophisticated investors. The second reason why I think you want to regulate it is you want to, if there's enough disasters without regulation, people are going to lose trust in the whole digital finance area, which I think it would be a mistake, because we think that the technology itself has a lot of promise. So, you want to have enough guardrails in place so you can experiment safely, so people can actually have confidence that this can actually move forward in a constructive way.
Do you have anything to add, Richard, to that?
No, I certainly echo those things. And, one of the things that we're going to talk about is how to achieve that balance between realizing the benefits of regulation with all the goals that we have for regulation: safety, soundness, as Bill mentioned, consumer and investor protection, making sure that markets have integrity, financial stability, all those things that are traditionally, goals for financial regulation.
So, Greg, you're in this industry, and you must look at this idea of regulation with a slightly different perspective. What for you would be the objectives and the principles we should follow for regulation?
Well, I think like with any regulation, Carolyn, I think that first and foremost, it needs to be thoughtful and it needs to be moderate. But I think in this case, we have an opportunity to change the narrative you traditionally hear about technology outpacing regulation exponentially. And I think we have an opportunity as a regulatory community and for all of the stakeholders in this emerging ecosystem to think about regulation with the future in mind. We need to start thinking about, who do we employ in the regulatory community? What are the technologists that we need to bring into this space? So that old narrative of technology outpacing, regulation and enforcement and things of that nature, I think it's high time we do something about that and we think about it differently. The thing that's fascinating about this industry, to me at least, is the number of ironies that abound in the digital asset space. And in my opinion, it's only going to be sound and thoughtful regulation, true regulatory clarity, that brings the next wave of adoption into it, not just here in the United States, but I would argue globally.
I think that's interesting, because there is a group, and I think it's a growing group of people in this space, at least I see it from the work that I do with the Creative Destruction Lab, who really are looking for regulation. Of course, they want it to be sensible. They want it to be particular to or designed in a way that kind of fits the crypto and the DeFi space, which is I guess a hard part to achieve. But certainly it's something that I think we could work on together. Bill, you've got a lot of experience with regulated entities, thinking about regulation. You've spent a lot of time thinking about this DeFi space, and in the third brief, it talks about truly decentralized blockchain technologies and the fact that there's opportunity there. In particular, one reason is because they don't rely on the middleman or authorities such as banks and financial institutions. And I'd like to hear what you think there about the opportunities that presents, and to what degree that provides a positive challenge to traditional FIs as these technologies are becoming more mainstreamed.
I think it's going to be challenging for traditional financial institutions to respond to this emerging technology, because it's a very different way of doing business. When you think about how the current financial system works, we have trust in intermediaries, and we have trust in those intermediaries because we trust that they're well managed, and we trust that they're well supervised and regulated. And we also have augmented that with things like federal deposit insurance, so that if something goes wrong, people are still protected. Blockchains, the trust is really more established by the process and the fact that you end up with an immutable final database, one true record of truth. So it's a very, very different system. I think it's also going to be challenging for incumbents because the legacy technology they're using is incredibly different in terms of it being very centralized, very batch oriented. And I think this is going to be particularly challenging for smaller institutions that don't really actually have their own technology. They basically go out to service providers who provide the technology to them, and they're locked into this technology through long-term contracts. So I think it's going to be very challenging, especially for the smaller financial institutions, which are very plentiful in the United States, to go on this migratory process. So I think this is going to be one of the key issues. How do you regulate in a way that you can allow everybody to come along?
Right, and we're gonna get to that because that speaks to one of the principles that are with respect to proportionality to the risks and having the same outcomes. I'm wondering, Richard, how do you see this cutting out the middleman in terms of positive change, and to what extent are there really as many differences as people would think between crypto and decentralization on the one hand and traditional finance? A lot of people call it TradFi. I almost did, but I'm trying to cut out the lingo.
You can do that.
I can do that because there's a lot of hype about what's different, and there are a lot of differences. But then there are similarities as well. So how do you see that? And then maybe as a second part, that kind of naturally leads you to think about the regulatory framework that we have today, and to what extent it fits, and to what extent it really doesn't.
Sure. Well, obviously, some of the services that are offered through these new platforms are similar to, in many respects, to the services that traditional financial institutions and markets offer. And I think it's important to focus on both the similarities and the differences, because at the end of the day, you're going to be talking about the service that might be improved by these technologies. And there are potentials, as Bill mentioned, for improvement. Our current system involves a lot of complexity, and this may be simpler. It may therefore offer more access. It may offer faster transactions. It may offer more opportunities for controlling risk, and those are some of the promises. And we work hard in traditional finance to work on those things, but sometimes the infrastructure we have and the complexity of the intermediation structure interferes with that. On the other hand, it's pretty clear also that the similarities between traditional finance and crypto and distributed or decentralized finance may pose some of the same risks that we see in traditional finance. So market, credit, liquidity, and contagion risk, operational, the opportunity for abuse and fraud, and somewhat created by opacity and concentration. So these are all going to be challenges for regulators. And of course, one of the big differences is that, as Bill mentioned, we have a system of regulation and intermediation that's based on entities by and large. But we ought to think about the activities in which these entities engage, because when we change the platform and the technology, a more activity-based thought process about how these ought to be looked at, I think, is really appropriate.
That's a good observation. I think we've been struggling with that. I say we in the international regulatory community is really woken up to the idea of the need to coordinate across different regulators, just because of the rise of non-bank financial intermediation, or where it's not just the bank regulator that needs to be involved, it's the securities regulators, among others, and they need to talk to each other to make sure that the regulations are coherent or compatible across these different regulators. So that's an interesting point. Greg, you're in this business in your present role. You're involved with digital assets and blockchain investments for the financial services industry. What insights could you share with us into the sentiment of investments, the sentiment of the clients, the consumers, with respect to blockchains, and also the use of those blockchains with respect to cryptocurrencies and tokens?
Well, thank you for the question. I think in some respects, we've seen this movie before, Carolyn. You know, consumer behavior mimics the traditional markets in crypto and digital right now. When everything is going fine and dandy, everybody wants to be a part of it. And of course, ever since we've seen this massive decline throughout the year, sentiment has gone down. McKinsey's done some terrific consumer sentiment studies. What I do think is telling about some of that data is in two dimensions, one of them primarily being in the volatility. There's an increase year over year of 10% of people pushing away from digital assets because of the volatility. But the largest move was in the trust. They don't trust the technology, which I know we're going to get into that in a discussion around underlying blockchain technology and smart contracts. Right now, at least in the United States market, we see the adoption in the industry at approximately 18% of American investors have some form of crypto or digital assets in their portfolio. And what's interesting about that is it hasn't moved very briskly over the past 3 years. That includes this massive upswing. And that's because the largest amount of crypto investment has come from two sides of the barbell, if you will. On the one side, you have the ultra high net worth and family office sets who invested in specific projects, very small head count, a lot of money. On the other side, you see a very large head count, but very de minimis contributions into all of the so-called cryptocurrencies and tokens. What's missing is all of the money that is currently managed by the wealth management industry. And I think that echoes in most of the developed world, although the statistics are slightly different. And in the irony, again, comes back to that regulation that we've been talking about, that regulatory clarity. When it comes to bear, that is going to see the next wave of adoption. And that's where we need to get ahead of this while we have this opportunity to catch our breath from a regulatory perspective.
So there's a demand for it, and there's somewhat of a supply of regulations coming. There's been a lot of papers, Richard. I don't want to catch off guard, but you know a little bit about the, I'm saying a little bit as an understatement about regulation in the U.S. And kind of in all its glory, and some of its maybe areas for improvement. And in June, and you just talked about kind of what's the same, what's different. I don't want to repeat that, but I was just thinking, is there a way to get specific about some of the actions that have been taken so far in the U.S.? For example, the Senate introduced a bipartisan crypto bill in June. There's been other actions taken by the regulators themselves. What would be your kind of top two things that you think are really good about that, and then areas that I think would address some of the concerns that you with your colleagues have expressed in the papers that were released today?
Sure. Well, I really don't want to comment on specific legislation, but what I would say is that, we're probably going to need legislation in several respects to give authority to regulators to do the right thing. And again, come back to the principle of we want to make sure that we can nurture innovation where it's appropriate and provides benefits to, the economy, to the financial system, to its clients. But at the same time, make sure that we have those goals that we traditionally embrace for regulatory safety and soundness. And, I think what Greg is talking about, and both Bill and Greg have mentioned the word trust twice. And I think that is really the key to thinking about what our regulatory goals ought to be aimed at, to build trust in not only the new technology by making it trustworthy, and making sure that we have technology, for example, that is, technology independent, if you will, to achieve those goals. But also when we get to the point of talking about specific tools, we have technology specific tools that aim us towards that goal. And I think that's pretty much the case with, the rest of our goals. We also need to think about the fact that in our regulatory universe, which is quite fragmented in the United States, for all their capabilities, regulators really lack the skills and don't have the resources to understand and to be able effectively to regulate, this new industry. So, Greg talked about how we're always one step behind. Well, in particular, in this space, we're maybe 2 or more steps behind, and the innovation is outrunning the capacity of the regulators to do the right thing. And the last thing I'd say is you need to have a partnership, especially in this case, well, maybe 2 partnerships. One is, because of the way that our regulatory system is structured, not just here, but around the world, this is really a team sport. And I think the regulators who are charged with specific responsibilities and authorities need to get together to achieve those goals, because they can be conflicting with each other, or they can be cooperative and work towards that goal collectively, which is probably beneficial. The second partnership I think is important is between the regulators and the community that's developing these new tools and new technologies, so that people can understand each other and the regulation can be balanced and appropriate and aimed specifically at the most consequential problems.
Yeah, I think that point is making sure that the regulators themselves, the supervisors, have an understanding of the technology and the issues related to it, the advantages of it. It's just key. It's a moving target. It is hard to keep up, but without that, we think that for banking regulation, you need to understand banking. This is no different.
Right.
And I think it's positive that a lot of central banks, a lot of regulators are catching on to that and have their own experiments, that they're working with the technology, where they're developing relationships with some of the fintechs and the big techs that are working in it. But I think it'll take time.
Can I make one more point, Carolyn?
Sure, absolutely.
I think one of the things we lack in this whole arena is good governance, rules of the game. What problems are we trying to solve? Who's going to make the decisions? Who has the authority to make them? All the things that make governance an appropriate way to make decisions and to promote accountability and transparency, because that's really important. We didn't spend a lot of time on that in this report, but it's kind of an overarching framework that we need in order to have good regulation.
Couldn't agree more about the governance issue. So Greg, why don't we, now you brought up governance, I mean, one of the big innovations here is, with respect to governance, is the smart contracts and the protocols. And so I'm wondering if you could talk about this, and what should we know? What should we know about these, and what's their role in the ecosystem?
I'd be happy to. Smart contracts aren't a big deal. They are a massive deal to this new world, right? They are at the be all and end all of so much of what's right and what's wrong currently right now with the industry. In theory, smart contracts appropriately designed and programmed should be a regulator's dream, because they would provide for and allow for the appropriate governance protocols to always be put in place. But as Bill alluded to at the opening, we saw a so-called algorithmic stablecoin not work the way that it was intended to. And so smart contracts, I think you have to go back to Nick Szabo, who gets the credit for this, Carolyn, about coming up with the notion of being able to write code that's going to perform a certain set of tasks at a certain set time and not need third parties to be involved. So on that side, it's also the crypto maximalist's dream, correct? We have technology that eliminates the need for all the third parties in every possible way, shape, or form. Somewhere in between is where we need to be. Right now, today, we are still being dragged by this persistent reputation of bad behavior, because there is bad behavior going on in especially the DeFi space, where smart contracts have been exploited time and time again because the code is so poorly written. The industry itself needs to do a couple of things very, very quickly. First of all, it needs to stop being so tone deaf. It needs to realize that the importance that people are getting hurt, when you do see all of the erasure, as Bill mentioned, again, tens of billions of dollars erased overnight because the code didn't work, there needs to be responsibility for that. And at the same point in time, we need the coders to start getting better at writing code. This goes back to BASIC and Pascal and all of those crazy nightmares from the early days of computer programming: garbage in, garbage out. And so what should be the anchor, the tether, no pun intended, for the industry to be sound, to not put people in bad way, has been compromised. And so I think the reputation of the industry really is going to be based on how quickly the coding community can be better at what they're supposed to be doing. It's honestly one of the biggest challenges we're facing right now.
So that was a good pun. I'm gonna do another one. So Bill, what's at stake? Actually, what you've said this so many times. I'm sure it's in brief 4. It's just something I've heard you say, and it makes a lot of sense to me. But I'd like you to elaborate on what that actually means in practice. And it's, you say, well, we need to promote responsible innovation. The risks need to be well managed, but our goal shouldn't be to drive risk to zero. So what do you mean by that exactly? And how would you operationalize that?
I think the first thing is you want the regulatory community to approach this, with some balance. You're trying to achieve good outcomes. So good outcomes are not zero risk, because if you actually were managing for zero risk, you wouldn't actually allow anybody to, operate in this space. So I think, one of the key, points that we're trying to make, I think, collectively, is we want regulation that focuses on outcomes. And if you think about the kind of outcomes that we tolerate in the traditional finance area, we do allow for some risk. But what we do is we protect consumers, we protect investors, especially less sophisticated consumers and investors. We demand good risk management, we demand good governance, we demand good data management. I mean, sure, there are obviously problems turn up all the time in the traditional finance area in terms of risk management. We see that all the time. But people are protected to a large degree, and the risks are managed in a way, with the exception of 2007, 2008, they're not systemic, and they don't threaten to take down the entire financial system. So I think it's okay for firms to have bumps in the road. I think it's okay for things not to go perfectly, because this is about benefits and cost. As long as the benefits outweigh the cost, then you want to go down this road. If you start to say we have to reduce risk to zero, you're basically saying, I don't care how big the benefits are. If there are any cost, I'm not going down this path, and that would be a mistake. I think this is particularly important too from the psychology of regulators. Regulators, I think, have a bit of a extreme risk aversion in this space, because they're afraid that if they allow something and it goes wrong, they'll be blamed. On the alternative side, if they prohibit it, well, they can't be blamed because nothing ever happened. What you lose, of course, in that realm is that you don't get the benefits of the innovation.
Carolyn, can I build off of something there? Would that be okay?
Oh yeah, for sure.
I couldn't agree with the last sentiment more, because that's what's happening right now in the retail financial advisory industry. The wealth management industry, the CFPs, the registered investment advisors, the broker-dealer affiliated folks, they're caught in this horrible dilemma that if they don't have something to say and they're barred from speaking largely about these topics, clients do what they're going to do, and they largely get over their skis and they take the blame. And then on the flip side, if they say something, the firms want to crack down on it. It puts them in a terrible dilemma. One thing we should realize is that despite all of the negative headlines around the performance of the digital asset industry today, we've never seen more institutional adoption and investment. As a matter of fact, from some very unlikely bedfellows. When you think about the big news from Fidelity earlier this year, investing in Bitcoin rails for their 401ks of all products, it's a sign of a level of gravitas that the industry is being taken very seriously. for all the bluster on the speeches and on the pulpits and the sound bites coming from, prominent CEOs from JP Morgan and Berkshire Hathaway. These are two firms that have made multi-billion-dollar investments in the crypto infrastructure, not just blockchain, but with digital assets in mind. Even Berkshire Hathaway has bought a more than $1 billion US stake in one of the largest crypto businesses in South America. It's not the only business of Nubank, but it's a huge part of their business. These are the signs that I think are hiding in plain sight that we in the regulatory community, and for those of us that are participants like Rubicon, we have to be paying attention to get ready for this movement.
So just on this theme that you brought up, Greg. So some of the traditional investors and then other investors are really pouring some money into this technology, but also to the business models that we call DeFi. Other examples, I don't know, Bill or Richard, either of you, any of you, in terms of traditional financial institutions adopting the technology themselves to provide the services that they provide before. I know there's an example in repo. And what do you think about that particular challenge to DeFi in the sense of you could use the technology, but in a centralized financial institution and get some of the efficiency gains? Maybe I'll start with you, Bill. And is that worrying, or is that kind of welcome?
I think what's going to happen is that there's a few use cases which we identified in an earlier brief that where you can imagine how the DeFi could actually lead to tremendous gains in efficiency and safety. So think about trade finance or cross-border payments or digital identity, where you could do things in a much more efficient way because you have a single source of truth. The blockchain database is a single source of truth, and that allows you to collapse settlement times, to minimize settlement risk. It allows you to not have to do a lot of reconciliation because there's only one record that's immutable. And so I think that what's going to happen is traditional finance is going to basically be looking at the areas that exist in the traditional finance space that are very inefficient today, very cumbersome today, where there's lots of intermediaries, where there's lots of residual risk in terms of settlement, and look at how the new technology can reduce this risk by eliminating settlement risk in many times, reducing the questions about the validity of the data and the need to reconcile the data, single source of truth. And then I think, once they gain experience in those realms, then the technology will probably migrate back more into the core business. That's my guess.
What do you think, Richard? And I'm just wondering, you mentioned governance. So is that sort of an advantage of traditional finance, or is it kind of hamstring them relative to where you think DeFi will end up if they do things right?
Well, governance is, probably better developed in traditional finance than it is in crypto and decentralized finance, but that doesn't mean it's where it should be. Far from it. And I think that we can do a much better job. And maybe the disruptive attributes of these new technologies are going to kind of force everybody to be more attentive to those things. We have some good governance, and as you were mentioning it, and Bill was talking, I was thinking about CCPs, an area where I've done a lot of work, central clearing, and the whole payments clearing and settlement process, which is complex, inefficient, has a number of risks involved, which are sometimes hard to manage. And we've seen what happens in stress periods when that process doesn't go exactly as we hoped it would. And maybe I think there are tremendous opportunities, especially given the volume of transactions that are processed in this way. And so the question is whether the technology is scalable, whether it has, the features in it that create trust. And I think governance is one of the things that we should look to try to establish a high level environment in which these things can really exist. So in the CCP arena, as everybody knows here, we have principles for financial market infrastructure that are important for payments. And those have really served us well in the past decade or so. But but have they served us well enough? Only insofar as people really start to translate them into specific, you know, things that we can make operational. Will they really help us? There's, you know, they're adequate as they stand, but you need to go beyond that and thinking about how to make these things operational so that people can trust the new technologies. People can trust the way that they are overseen and whether they are transparent and whether people are accountable in that space.
Bill, you are an expert in this particular CPMI space, so I'm going to turn it back to you and have you reflect on those principles and how that might apply to this new crypto land.
Yeah, there's a whole issue of having a level playing field across the different jurisdictions, and that's challenging. And how we approached it for CCP's central clearing houses was basically by establishing a set of principles based on what outcomes we wanted to achieve. So, for example, we decided that central clearing parties should be able to withstand the default of their two largest customers and still survive. And then we left it to the individual countries to decide how to actually operationalize it. So the focus was on outcomes. What outcomes do we want to achieve? Then we leave it to you to decide how to do it, recognizing that each country has a different institutional setup. You have different sets of regulations. So you can't just, write regulations and sort of port them around the world. But if you focus on the outcomes that you seek, you can get agreement on those outcomes, then you can actually have a set of coherent regime. Now, the principles for financial market infrastructures, which were developed a number of years ago, have been pretty successful because there was also a bit of an enforcement mechanism. The IMF was basically empowered to go into countries and evaluate were they actually implementing their processes and technologies and regulations in a way that was going to actually achieve the outcomes of the principles for financial market infrastructures where the countries had agreed to. So I think you also need a little bit of an enforcement process to ensure that the principles are not just sitting up there in an abstract way, but the countries are actually carrying out what's necessary to achieve those outcomes. The focus, I think, we feel very strongly about is the technology is different, the processes are different, but you want to have similar outcomes. So you need to sort of craft the regulation, focusing on what outcomes you're trying to achieve, recognizing that the old regulations are probably not going to be optimal for the new regime.
I couldn't agree more with that. And, I think that one of the things that we can really explore more fully, we made a first step in, I think, in this brief, but we can explore more fully where the gaps are so that enforcement process can be really spelled out for people in a way that makes it clear what they're supposed to do and what they're not supposed to do.
Yeah, I think the peer reviews kind of helped clarify, an outside view about what you're doing. And there's a little bit of we don't want to be singled out as a country that's not, at least at par with international best practices. So that's very powerful. And it's quite good. John Cunliffe is Deputy Governor at the Bank of England. He's chairing that committee right now. And they've come out with some work, particularly on stable coins, which is quite a good fit for that particular committee. And the committee I'm on is set expectations at a high level for stable coins that's being turned into legislation. So there is progress being made. I think there's a lot left to do. Greg, I'm just looking. I wanted to make sure that we ended on a note about back to the technology in a sense, because there's this whole industry, the technology itself. The applications feel that even though it's been going on for a while now, it's still in its infancy. And so I think no one has a crystal ball about how exactly it's going to shake out. And I'm just wondering, maybe to you to start, but if others want some final words before we turn to the audience questions, what do you think are the challenges that exist today that this technology needs to get over? And what would be your top thing that they really need to tackle?
I'm facing the challenges of electricity here in the IMF building, so my apologies. Number one, but what an important question to be asking right now, because I think it makes all the difference in the world. we really are at the infancy. So I think and that's good because we have a chance to catch up here now. We have a chance both from an innovation perspective and to put thought behind regulation and governance in a way that maybe we wouldn't have if there wasn't this kind of disruption that's been taking place right now. When I think about being at the infancy of the business, I'm also reminded that we must take stock of, I think, one of the biggest challenges that I'm dealing with day to day is the realities of living in a world where social media directs and commands a disproportionate amount of attention, focus, and risk than we've ever had to deal with in the financial services industry before, or in any industry for that matter. We were joking a little bit earlier about England and so forth, but kudos to the FCA for at least taking a harder, clearer stance about social media influencers. And when I think about one of the biggest challenges I see at the grassroots level in the industry is why are people getting involved in digital assets and crypto? Because of the influence of social media and technology. And I would say we have an opportunity to refocus on both how we combat that and how we focus regulation first and foremost on that area. And the SEC has already been fairly clear about that. They put out warnings before the Kim Kardashian penalties of 2 weeks ago for people that are aware of that. They were already alerting anybody who reads SEC newsletters that, hey, we're seeing that this is increasing in its frequency. So that's one thing that we really need to wrap around. And then the other is, if we truly want to get ahead, if we truly believe that the future is digital in however it evolves into, and I'm not saying that we shouldn't use a 1940s, a citrus grove in Florida standard of the Howey test to determine what's a security and what isn't. I think it's fairly obvious most of these tokens meet that test. What I'm saying, trying to bring some levity to the point, is that I think we need to reinvent how we're thinking about the next 50, 100 years of regulation and enforcement, both here in the United States. And this is the catalyst perhaps to do that. I think our existing agencies dominated by the SEC and the CFTC, they've been weighing in very heavily, perhaps too much in conflict. But what we perhaps really need is to rethink the entire apparatus as it applies to what is not going away, and that is the digital ecosystem.
Great. Okay, so I'm going to turn to Richard and then Bill. You have a minute and a half each before, maybe I'll just say a minute, so it'll be a minute and a half before we go back to Emily so that she can moderate the questions from our guests. So Richard, anything to add to that?
Well, I'd just say, having been in the position of someone who informs regulators and policymakers, I think that what Greg said is really admirable, and the aspiration to have a real hard look at the way we do things is really terrific, and we should always keep that in mind. But we also need to think about what's possible and not make mistakes as we go along, and try to do the things that are going to address the most immediate problems, and come back to establishing the principles that we talked about: same risk, same outcome, building trust in the system. And I think, as we go along the path, those are the things that are going to help us really move it forward.
Bill?
For me, one thing I just want to encourage regulators to move faster and be more open-minded about the potential benefits of the new technology. I worry so much that there's a little bit of bias towards not approving something, because if you approve it and it goes bad, you get blamed, as opposed to approving something and it works and the entire country and world benefit. So there can be errors on both sides, and I feel like in the regulatory community, one of the challenges is they just don't have the expertise on staff, expertise about the DeFi, expertise about the technology, expertise about how the technology is different, how this translates in terms of requirements for governance and risk management. So I think it's really important that the regulators make a concerted effort to catch up. And I think it's also important that they move faster, because we need guardrails to protect people. The last year, there's been a lot of damage in this space. Some because of bad coding, like that was pointed out earlier. Others due to the fact that there's lots of scams in this space. So I think that, we need the regulators to respond more quickly, with more force, and probably in the United States, at least, with more unity.
Consistency.
Yeah, the number of scams reported to the FCA in the UK that are related to crypto exceed all the other ones in total. They've increased so much, and that's kind of a recent statistic, but it's not good to build trust. But okay, so thank you so much for that discussion. We're going to have more of it. I'm going to turn it over to Emily. I see there's lots of cues, and over to you to moderate that.
Thank you, Carolyn. Yeah. Thank you, everyone. We do have some questions from the audience that I want to get to. I first want to go to Lee Stevens. He has a question I think that you guys touched on this theme a little bit about sort of the interaction between traditional finance and the digital industry and the relationship there. So Lee, can you go ahead and ask your question?
Thank you, Emily, and thank you for this wonderful panel. My question was in response to Bill's comment about the smaller banking institutions being able to get access to this technology, which is expensive, and it requires a lot of technical leadership. Just early this week, my employer got approval to offer digital asset custody, and I imagine others will follow. My question to Bill is, do you think that some of the correspondent relationships that smaller banks have with the larger institutions that are making these investments may be a way for them to be able to ultimately offer safe digital asset solutions to their downstream clients?
I mean, I certainly think that's one approach that will probably follow forward. I think the other thing is we also have a Federal Reserve that has established payment services that benefit the entire banking system and support the entire banking system. You think about the check clearing. The Federal Reserve entered the check clearing business to basically make it so that there was a level playing field between smaller institutions and larger institutions. And so I think it's going to be very interesting to see where the Federal Reserve in particular goes in terms of a central bank digital currency and how that is rolled out and made available to both large and small institutions. That's going to be an important decision for the central bank. I think it is going to happen in the U.S., but I think the Federal Reserve is probably going to be a slow follower rather than a rapid innovator in that particular space.
Anybody else want to follow up before we go to the next question? All right, I'm going to go to William Janis next. I like this question. William, could you please go ahead and unmute your microphone and pose your question?
Yeah, thank you. Quick question on the efficacy of the global sandboxes like Bank for International Settlements in terms of fashioning regulatory responsible platforms for digital assets. There's been a global MOU signed, so it's been a hot area.
So as someone who went to Basel over 50 times, I should take that question. I think that the BIS has two sort of potential channels for being very helpful in this space. Number one, it is the Bank for International Settlements. And so you can sort of imagine that the Bank for International Settlements could get involved in making sure that the different country systems can actually interface with one another in the digital finance space. So having standards that basically allow these different country regimes to talk to one another so you can actually have a global system. And the second, the Bank for International Settlements hosts the Financial Stability Board. And it's really the Financial Stability Board that I think is going to set the global ground rules for this particular space. And so the Financial Stability Board's work, I think, is going to establish what are the principles of regulation that we want to accomplish, and then leave it to the individual countries to actually carry that out in practice.
Yeah, if I could add to that.
Carolyn, yeah, you.
I'm not sure I went to Basel 50 times, but it might feel like I did. That there are the BIS kind of sandboxes, but different central banks and also other kinds of regulators also have sandboxes. And I was senior deputy governor of the Bank of Canada when we set up our own, didn't call it a sandbox, but we did blockchain experiments called Project Jasper. We partnered with the Monetary Authority of Singapore and their Project Ubin, along with the Bank of England. And you know, there were a number of benefits. And I think first and foremost, it allowed us to interact with players that were in the field and develop an understanding early on. This is kind of back in 2013, 2014, that meant that when we talk to these people, we've actually, rolled up our sleeves and tried to build something with them. It's a completely different, it's a completely different mentality when you do that. And certainly the BIS is just a function of all its members. And so to the extent that central banks were contributing to these sandboxes are knowledgeable, that's very valuable. I think the second thing is it helped us figure out blockchain is like distributed ledger technology is like books. There are different kinds, right? They're not all the same technology. They have different consensus mechanisms. Some are permission, some aren't. It allowed us to see which kinds of blockchains might actually be useful for activities that were more central to the financial system, like cross-border payments or central bank digital currency. And very early on, it was clear that some degree of permissioning was actually kind of needed to meet the principles for financial market infrastructure that Bill put together, among other things. And so it kind of narrowed the playing field, at least for certain types of projects that would be of service to central banks and kind of the core of the financial system.
And that interaction, is really important. It's what I refer to as the partnerships between the regulators and the industry, so that each can learn from the other. And that's what's going to advance things more rapidly. I've been involved in a number of private initiatives for these, if you will, tech sprints and so on. And people at the FCA have advanced that, and other private and private entities are also involved in advancing that. So I think we need to come together and find out what's fit for purpose and what isn't in all these initiatives.
Thanks. I'm going to go to our next question here. Lyric Hale, if you would go ahead and unmute your microphone and pose your question. I think this is kind of a good follow-up to the conversation we just had about sandboxes. Lyric, you there?
Yes, I am. Thank you. Hello, everyone from
you.
Chicago.
Hello.
The reality of cryptocurrency expertise is that you have it. If you have it, you're not going to be part of the government, probably. The incentives are in the private sector. So why don't regulators contract out this expertise and, have a more meaningful interaction with people who do have the true expertise, who are the innovators? Why not create a forum for that and actually, maybe pay them to do this research for you? And my second question is GBTC. What is a no-brainer? What is the holdup with that? It just seems so, it's gone on, and now there's a suit with the SEC. It's really, how do you explain to investors why that's not happening? If GBTC can't get approved, what can get approved?
I'd like to take the first part, if I can, Lyric, and thank you. That's a very timely question indeed. I would say that you already are seeing an unprecedented level of cooperation, I think, between governments and regulators and state actors that have realized they need to bring in subject matter expertise unlike they ever have before. Certainly you can look here in Washington, D.C., and you can see the presence of firms like Chainalysis and TRM Labs that have very, very deep subject matter expertise and capabilities.
Yeah.
And so I think you're starting to see that. And I'm also seeing what we're seeing, at least, we're seeing a more a proactive outreach to the technology community to bring those minds in to help inform it. As to the second part of your question, that really is an enigma right now. It becomes harder and harder to reconcile why, for those that are unaware of the question and the background, one of the leading largest asset managers, if you will, in crypto have been relegated to having not having a spot ETF product, okay, but having a futures ETF product, and have been relegated to having products that are investment contracts and underperforming, very inflexible. And so they've put forth very, very sensible requests for approval that haven't been able to make their way through. And this is maybe a sign of many of the comments you heard woven from Bill and others about the need to open up a little bit and not have zero risk, but have appropriate risk along with the disclosures and everything else and suitability that, you know, our industry has been bedrocked on. So that would be my first take.
If I could just jump in here for just a second. I think that the regulators are not going to outsource the regulation. I don't think that's just realistic because they own the risk. When something goes wrong, they're the ones that are blamed and responsible for that. But what I think they could do a lot more of is set up advisory groups, set up task force to look at questions jointly with the participants in the industry to say, here's the problems that we're trying to solve. This is what we want to solve. How should we do it? What's the best way forward? This has been done in a number of other areas that were difficult to resolve. For example, the tri-party repo system was essentially broken during the great financial crisis, and the Federal Reserve Bank of New York knew that they had to fix it. But that required a lot of effort by the clearing banks, the securities dealers, the investor base. And so it wasn't like the Federal Reserve had the authority just to go make this happen. So they convened a group of all these parties to work on the problem and figure out what's the best way to achieve the outcomes that we all seek. We all seek to have a system that's safe. We all seek to have a system that's not subject to runs, to systemic problems. And I think, you know, setting up those kind of advisory groups or even task force on particular problems, I think is a good way forward.
Yeah, having been involved in some of those myself, I found it extremely useful. And I think the people who are involved in it also found it useful because they can get together and talk about common problems and how to achieve the outcomes that everybody's looking for. The other thing that relates to that, I think, is they help industry and regulators arrive at codes of conduct, which is, again, part of the governance conversation. And if you have people agree on what are best practices that are going to achieve the outcomes that people want, then that creates the expectation that people are going to stick to those things and not deviate from them. That acts as a self-regulatory mechanism as well. But you need the enforcement to be sure, but you need to have people understand what they're responsible for.
Yeah, I think we have an example of a code of conduct that was worked on that's put in place, the foreign exchange code of conduct. You know, I don't think the industry needs to work with the regulators for sure. I don't think they should necessarily wait for the regulators to do everything. There's a lot they can do themselves.
Yeah, the Treasury Market Practices Group is another example of that.
Okay, we have just a couple of minutes left. I'm going to use my prerogative here to ask the final question. You know, we've talked a lot about kind of regulatory gaps in the U.S. and Bank of England. I mean, FCA, ECB. I mean, all of these different regulators across the different regions are working on this issue. You know, how much coordination is taking place, and how much coordination do we think is needed in this space right now globally?
More. That's my take.
Yeah,
there's a lot going on. Go ahead, Bill.
Yeah, my take is quite a bit more, but the major area where we need progress is in the United States, because the dollar is the reserve currency of the world, and when you look at all of the DeFi activity, a tremendously large proportion of it is ultimately tied back to the U.S. dollar. So if the U.S. doesn't get it right, we have big problems, even if everybody else gets it right.
Agreed.
Agreed.
And can we learn more from what others are doing?
Yeah, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Sure. No question. And I think there's a lot going on, which maybe for a variety of reasons, some of the people who are collaborating with each other aren't ready to talk about. But they need to find ways to make those conversations available to people so they know in general what the direction of travel looks like.
Yep. Well, I think that's a fantastic way to end this session of our International Council Conference on the international note. Want to thank all of you very much for joining today, for your work on these two briefs. Again, to our audience, they're available on our website, so you can find them there. I just want to put a plug in. We're going to be discussing these digital issues much more going forward, as we've heard in our work. But we are actually going to be hosting a Future of Finance forum that's going to be focused on digital crypto assets and regulation. And that's going to be in Singapore in partnership with the DBS Group. BWC is going to be hosting that conference on November 7th, right on the heels of the Singapore FinTech Festival. So hope that some of you can potentially join us in Singapore. Keep joining us for our International Council. We continue here in 1 hour. So hope to see many of you back here for our conversation on trade with USTR Ambassador Catherine Tai. We've got a couple more sessions tomorrow. So thanks, everybody. International Council continues. Hope to see you all at future sessions. Thanks again,
Thank
speakers
you.
and audience today. Thanks.
Thank you
Thanks
so
for the
much.
opportunity.